Today's objective is today we'll determine the appropriate tool to measure an object in customary units of length. Now it's your turn to repeat the objective back to me. Are you ready? Let's go. Today I will determine the appropriate tool to measure an object in customary units of length. You got it. Now it's time to go over our important vocabulary for today. Now, the first word, inch, is a word you recognize from yesterday. Can everybody repeat the word inch? Nice job. Now, an inch can be abbreviated with two letters, I-N period, meaning that's the faster way to write inches, or inch. And an inch is about the length of the tip of your thumb to your first knuckle on your finger. It's also the smallest customary unit of length, and we measure inches using a ruler. At the top of the picture, you can see a ruler, and there are two units of measurement on a ruler. On one side, there are inches, so I've labeled it inches. On the other side, there are centimeters, so I've labeled it centimeters. And you can see arrows, almost like a number line, hopping from one number to the next. Well, anytime you see a bunny hop, that represents 1 inch on a ruler. The next word we have in our important vocabulary today is foot. Can you say foot? Nice job. Now, foot can be abbreviated with two letters also, F-T period. And an abbreviation, or FT period, is just a faster way to write foot. Now remember, a foot is equal to 12 inches total, and it's also about the length of your elbow to your wrist. We measure feet using a ruler. At the top of your screen, you can see a picture of a ruler. There are 12 bunny hops because remember, any bunny hop represents 1 inch. And on a ruler, there are 12 inches, so 12 total bunny hops altogether. Our final vocabulary word for today is yard. Can you say yard? Nice job. Now, yard can be abbreviated or shortened to YD period. Remember, an abbreviation is just a faster way to write a word. In this case, we're talking about the abbreviation for the word yard. Now, a yard is 36 inches total, which is also equal to 3 feet total. We measure yards using a yardstick or a tape measure. Now, yardsticks really do exist, and we have some in our classroom. But at home, I definitely don't have a yardstick, and my guess is most of you probably don't either. But that's not to worry because you can make a yardstick by combining 3 rulers side by side, like you can see in the image above. Ruler 1, right lined up next to ruler 2, right lined up next to ruler 3, and you've got yourself a yardstick. To complete today's lesson, there are some steps for you to follow. Step 1 is to decide if the object should be measured in inches, feet, or yards, and step 2 is to decide which measuring tool would be most appropriate to use. So choosing between a ruler, a yardstick, or a tape measure. In addition to following those steps, I also need to remember these measuring rules. For small objects, I need to remember that as my measuring tool, I usually will choose a ruler, and I measure small objects using inches. For medium-sized objects, I'll usually use a yardstick, and I would measure using feet or yards. For large objects, I would use a measuring tape, and I would measure using the units feet or yards. So remember, small objects include things like a glue stick or a marker. Medium-sized objects include things like our pocket chart, and large objects include things like our classroom or our school. Now it's time for me to model a couple of problems. The directions at the top of the page say, determine the best unit of measurement and tool to use. Number 1 says, which unit and tool would be most appropriate to use to measure the height of the cafeteria? Then it has a spot for me to write in the unit of measurement, so inches, feet, or yards, and it has a spot for me to write in the best tool to use to measure the cafeteria. Now, to answer this question, I need to address one part of it specifically, because in the question, it names a cafeteria. Well, at Washington, we don't technically have a cafeteria. We have a cat cafe, and we do have a room, though, that's really similar to a cafeteria like other schools, and that's our NPR. So I'm going to go with our NPR for this question. Now, it says to measure the height of the cafeteria, or in this case, the NPR. So I'm thinking about which unit of measurement would be the best to measure the height. So from the floor up to the top of the ceiling. Now, I'm thinking and picturing the NPR in my mind, and I'm seeing myself standing in it, and if I were to look up, I would see that there's so much space between the top of my head and the ceiling. So that means that the NPR is a really, really big object. So in that case, I would probably measure using feet or yards. I could choose either or both. In this case, I'm going to choose just feet. As my tool, I would use a measuring tape because I can stretch a measuring tape all the way from the floor to the ceiling. If I used a ruler, I would have to use finger marks to hold my place, and that would take a really long time. Same thing with the yardstick. So a measuring tape is just the most efficient and the most effective tool to use in this case. On the screen, you are seeing how I completed my worksheet today. In the blank spot where it says unit of measurement, I wrote in the word feet because I decided that to measure the height of the NPR, it would be best to use feet as my unit. I wouldn't want to use inches because inches are so small, and I could have also chosen yards, but I just went with feet. As my tool, I decided to use a measuring tape. And remember, I chose a measuring tape because the NPR is really big, and we use measuring tapes to measure large objects. Now, for problem 2, the directions are the same to determine the best unit of measurement and tool to use. And number 2 says, determine the most appropriate unit of measurement and tool to find the length of a dollar bill. So again, there's a spot for my unit of measurement, and there I'm choosing between inches, feet, and yards. And there's also a spot for my measuring tool. So I get to choose between a ruler, a yardstick, or a measuring tape. So for number 2, I'm imagining a dollar bill. And dollar bills are relatively small, especially when we compare them to the length of a classroom or our school or the height of the NPR. So I'm thinking that for my unit of measurement for a dollar bill, the most appropriate unit would be inches. Remember, we use inches for smaller objects. Now, as far as the tool goes, the best measuring tool for small objects is a ruler. So I'm going to write in the word ruler. If I were to use a yardstick, it would be way longer than the actual dollar. And I wouldn't want to use a measuring tape because, remember, measuring tapes are used for very, very large objects like the length of our classroom or the length of our school. On the screen, you can see that for my unit of measurement, to measure the length of a dollar bill, I chose inches. Remember, a dollar bill is not a very large object, so I chose the unit that we use to measure small objects with. As far as my tool went, you can see that I wrote in the word ruler. And remember, rulers are used for small objects. So now it's time for you to do some independent practice pages. You are going to head to Google Classroom as usual, and you're going to find that you have 2 options. Option 1 is to print off the worksheets and to do them by hand. If you choose option 1, remember you still have to do a math presentation for your final check for understanding. Option 2 is to complete the Seesaw editable template. So follow the link and then submit your work there, and then also do a student presentation for your final check. Can't wait to see how measuring is going today. Good luck!